The Iran-US war is no longer a two-country story. It is a network story. Once missiles cross borders, the map widens. Not always by choice. Sometimes by retaliation, sometimes by geography, sometimes because bases and airspace turn into magnets. So here are the three questions that matter. Which countries are already involved, and how? Which countries could be pulled in next? And what the war looks like right now, as of March 2nd, 2026. Start with what is confirmed in the public timeline. February 28th, 2026. The United States and Israel carried out coordinated strikes inside Iran. That day marks a shift from long-running shadow conflict to open, direct war. The same day, Iran responded. Missiles and drones launched across the region. Then March 1st, 2026. The war expanded in two ways. First, continued strikes and retaliation. Second, outside states taking defensive action, even if they did not want to be part of it. That is the frame. Now map the participants. First circle, direct belligerents. The United States, the US is not just providing support, it is directly engaged. That means US forces, bases, and naval assets become targets in Iran's view. And that raises the probability of continued tit-for-tat escalation. Israel is also directly engaged. Israel's involvement changes the political gravity of the conflict. Israel's war aims and threat perceptions are not identical to Washington's. That can create momentum. A joint campaign can keep running. Even if one side becomes cautious, Iran is the other direct belligerent. Iran has multiple tools: conventional missiles and drones, naval harassment and maritime risk, cyber and information operations, and aligned groups outside Iran's borders. Iran's most dangerous leverage is not only firepower, it is geography. The Gulf is a choke point system, not a normal battlefield. So those are the core parties: United States, Israel, Iran. Now move outward. Second circle, countries hit, hosting US forces or pulled into defense. This is the most misunderstood group. These states may not want to join the war offensively, but their territory, airspace, or critical infrastructure can still become part of the battle space. United Arab Emirates. As of February 28th and March 1st, the UAE has been hit and disrupted. Even if the UAE does not strike Iran, it can still be treated as part of the battlefield. If US systems operate from, through, or near it, Bahrain hosts major US naval presence. That makes it structurally exposed. Even if Bahrain does nothing offensively, geography makes it a target in an expanded retaliation cycle. Qatar hosts major US assets. That makes it strategically sensitive. Again, involvement is not only who fires, it can be who hosts. Kuwait hosts US presence and has been affected in the retaliation wave. Saudi Arabia sits in a hard position. It does not want direct war with Iran, but it cannot ignore attacks, overflights, or strikes near its territory. Saudi decisions also shape oil markets and coalition dynamics. That alone creates pressure. Jordan often becomes a spillover zone in regional missile and drone exchanges. It may be forced into air defense actions even if it prefers neutrality. Iraq is a critical corridor. US forces operate there. Iran-aligned groups operate there. The risk of attacks around bases and airports makes Iraq one of the easiest places for the war to expand. Without formal declarations, Oman matters because of maritime geography near the Strait of Hormuz. Incidents at sea can drag coastal states into emergency security measures fast. This entire circle shares one dilemma. They can try to stay out, but the war can still enter their airspace, ports, or cities. And the moment civilians are hit, domestic politics changes. Neutrality becomes harder to sell. Restraint becomes harder to maintain. So this second circle is not new allies. It is states under pressure. Third circle, proxy and aligned armed groups. This is where escalation can accelerate, because proxies can widen the map without a formal state decision. Hezbollah in Lebanon. If Hezbollah expands attacks, Israel expands strikes. If Israel expands strikes, the Lebanon front becomes a major theater. That is one of the clearest routes to a wider war. Iraqi militias aligned with Iran. This is the most direct route to sustained attacks on US forces. Bases, logistics nodes, airports, convoys. Repeated casualties create political inevitability. Even if Washington wants restraint, it becomes harder to hold once deaths accumulate. The Houthis in Yemen. The Houthis can pressure maritime routes, not only by attacking ships, but by changing insurance behavior and rerouting decisions. A Houthi escalation does not need to sink everything. It only needs to create persistent uncertainty in a shipping corridor. Uncertainty becomes economic shock. Economic shock becomes political pressure in distant capitals. Here is the key point about proxies. They can act faster than governments can negotiate. They can escalate while diplomats talk. That is why proxy activation is one of the strongest signals for a wider war. Fourth circle, countries providing defensive support or moving toward involvement. This is where who might join becomes real. The United Kingdom. On February 28th, the UK publicly stated it was involved in regional defensive operations. Then March 1st, the UK announced it would allow the United States to use British bases for limited defensive strikes targeting Iranian missile capabilities. That is not a declaration of war, but it is involvement because it expands the operational footprint and it increases the number of assets Iran may consider part of the enemy network, France and Germany. On February 28th and March 1st, the E3, Britain, France, Germany, issued joint messaging condemning Iranian attacks on regional states, signaling readiness to take defensive action if necessary. That does not mean France and Germany are striking Iran today, but it does mean a defensive coalition framework is forming. Frameworks matter in wars, because once you build an air defense coalition, the next step can happen quickly. If more missiles fly, notice the pattern. Outside powers get pulled in through defense first. Not offense. Interceptions. Base access. Defensive strikes on launchers. That is often how escalation looks before it looks like a classic alliance war. Fifth circle. Major powers watching and shaping. Russia. Russia has condemned the US and Israeli strikes and is positioning diplomatically against them. The key question is not what Russia says. The key question is what Russia does. Material support, air defense systems, intelligence, financial channels. If Russia increases material support in a way that changes Iran's capability, the risk profile rises. If Russia stays mostly rhetorical, the war remains region-centered. China is balancing stability against strategic opportunity. China's primary exposure is energy and trade stability. If the Gulf becomes unstable, China pays economically. So China's incentive is de-escalation, but China also has incentives to reduce US influence. That points toward diplomacy and economic tools, not direct military moves. North Korea. North Korea has condemned the strikes and framed them as illegal aggression. Direct military involvement is unlikely, but the rhetoric shows how US adversaries use this conflict to shape narratives. Now the audience question, which countries could still join more directly? Think in pathways. Pathway 1. Repeated hits on Gulf states. If the UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, or Saudi Arabia keep absorbing strikes, the probability rises that one or more responds more forcefully, not because they want to, because politics may demand it. Even defensive retaliation can start a cycle. Pathway 2. Sustained attacks on US forces. If casualties keep accumulating in Iraq, the Gulf, or at sea, Washington's response options narrow. Sustained casualties push wars into a higher gear. Pathway 3. Maritime disruption. If the Strait of Hormuz becomes a repeated incident zone, major economies face immediate pressure. Then you get new involvement. Naval escorts, mine countermeasures, maritime patrol coalitions. Those coalitions can include European states and others with trade exposure. Pathway 4. Lebanon front expansion. If Hezbollah expands operations and Israel responds at scale, Lebanon becomes a main theater. That can pull in regional states through humanitarian pressure, refugee pressure, and security spillover. Pathway 5. Cyber escalation into civilian systems. If cyber attacks start causing widespread outages, banking, airports, power grids, ports, governments treat it as strategic attack, not noise. Cyber escalation can pull in states that were previously neutral, because everyone depends on the same digital systems. So what does the war look like right now? As of March 2nd, 2026, first, it is multi-domain, airstrikes, missiles and drones, maritime risk, cyber pressure, Second, it is geographically wider than the initial strike map. Even if only 3 states are core belligerents, the effects are regional. Airspace disruptions, port disruptions, oil market shock, civilian anxiety in countries that did not choose the war. Third, there is a leadership shock inside Iran. That kind of shock can create unpredictability. A transition can open negotiations, or it can trigger internal competition and hardline escalation. If factions need to prove legitimacy, escalation becomes performance. Fourth, external actors are being pulled in through defense first. This is the detail many miss. Defense leads to base access leads to defensive strikes. Defensive strikes lead to retaliation. Retaliation creates the argument for more defense, and the spiral forms. So what should we watch now? Signal 1. Are Gulf states still being hit repeatedly? One-off incidents create anger. Repeated incidents create policy change. Signal 2. Are U.S. casualties increasing through sustained attacks on bases and ships? If casualties trend upward, escalation probability rises. Signal 3. Is maritime traffic behavior changing? Not just rhetoric. Insurance spikes, reroutes, port slowdowns, sustained shipping withdrawals. If commercial behavior changes for several days in a row, the crisis is moving into the global economy. Signal 4. Is the E3 moving from statements to operational action? Defensive operations can broaden quickly if salvos continue. Signal 5. Is Hezbollah expanding its role? A Lebanon front becomes a two-theater war for Israel immediately. Signal 6. Are Russia or China making material moves that change the battlefield? Not speeches. Material moves. If these signals remain stable, the war may stay region-centered, even if brutal. If several spike together, the war becomes structurally harder to contain. Because in this kind of war, the next participants are often decided by geography, not intention. This week, watch 3 things. Any shift from being hit to striking back by Gulf states. Any confirmed pattern of sustained attacks on U.S. forces outside Israel and Iran. Any sustained disruption in maritime traffic through Hormuz and nearby routes. If those stay contained, there is still room for ceilings and off-ramps. If they rise together, the conflict moves into a wider phase. And once a wider phase begins, the list of participants grows fast.